One of the many benefits of separating the concerns of the models, views, and controllers in an MVC application is that each of the three components is able to contain all of the code with which it's concerned. This means, for example, that the view is only concerned with the user interface and contains only the code that displays a page and data to the user. It doesn't have any business logic, data access, or any other code unrelated to the user interface. In the same way, an MVC model is concerned only with data and business logic, nothing else. It interacts with a data source, such as SQL Server, and takes care of all the CRUD operations for maintaining data. In theory, this helps maintain a clean separation of concerns with the other MVC components. But unfortunately, not everything is always so black and white or neatly partitioned. One issue that would seem like it crosses the component boundary is data validation. On one side, a relational database has certain requirements for data, such as a product ID that is an integer, and that the company name is a string of 1 to 50 characters, for example. No more, no less. It may also mandate that every product be assigned a non-null product category, and that a US zip code be either 5 or 9 characters in length. Those are all examples of rules for data that a database would enforce. Beyond those data type sort of requirements, you may also have business logic that requires that an email address be of a format that meets the requirements of the Internet, or that no customer can receive more than 5 orders a year with greater than a 20% discount. All of these data and business logic rules are in place to ensure that the stored data is of the highest quality and that the application doesn't allow any violations of the rules by which the business operates. But where and how should you define these rules? On the one hand, they seem to be the domain of the model because most underlying data stores have requirements that must be met to store data. And because an MVC model is the proper location for business rules, it seems clear that they go into the model. So where should you implement the data validation rules, in the view or in the model? Well, the good news is that with an MVC model, there's a clear answer. It needs to be in the model. You add attributes to the properties and classes that implement the model that define the data validation rules. And you can add other data annotations that guide how the view should use the properties of the model. The view can then look at those rules and annotations and can then enforce the rules and appropriately modify how it displays the data to the user. The view's role in data validation is to take the rules defined in the model without defining any of its own and provide a user interface that enforces those rules. Best of all, since the rules are part of the model, they'll be in effect no matter where you use the model, across all views and all controllers. There's no need to duplicate the rules anywhere in the application. This is an application of the DRY principle of an MVC application. Don't repeat yourself. So as we explore data validation, you'll see that the result is that you can implement a very clear, clean separation of data validation rules. We're going to revisit the DOG model from a little bit earlier and see how you can use data validation and annotations to help the user create valid data. Now, in order to do that in an MVC application, you implement data validation in the model by decorating the model's properties with validation attributes. All of these attributes are part of the system.componentModel.dataAnnotations namespace. And these are going to handle most of the common validation requirements that you have. And even if you come across any situation that requires another kind of validation, you can always create a custom validation attribute class by inheriting from the base system.componentModel.dataValidations.ValidationAttribute class. That's the same class that the built-in annotations inherit from. All right, so the several different validation attributes include data type. This lets you specify a data type that is more specific than the intrinsic data type and uses the data type enumeration. The enumeration has a number of useful formats, including date, time, email address, password, URL, and so forth. Then the range validation attribute lets you specify the numeric range in which valid values have to fall. It has both minimum and maximum properties. You can use the regular expression validation attribute in order to define the format with which the data has to comply. And you use the pattern parameter to specify the regular expression. You can use the required attribute in order to say that the data value is required. There has to be something that's provided for that field. This particular class has really no interesting parameters, but by its presence, it does its work. And then finally, there's the string length. It sets the maximum number of characters allowed in the data value, and it has a maximum attribute value. Unfortunately, there's no minimum attribute value, so you'll have to do something different if you have a minimum string length. Now, all of these classes have an error message parameter that let you specify an error message that a view can then use to let the user know of a problem. And you can also retrieve those messages from a resource file so that you can localize the application. Now, one caution here. Even though the data type attribute sounds interesting, and it is a validation attribute, and even though it inherits from the validation attribute class like all of the other validation attributes, it's really not useful for validation. If you look at the source code for that namespace, its isValid property is hardwired to always return true. Don't ask why. There are some things about Microsoft that are just better left unknown. So let's see how you can use these within a custom model. Here's the dog model that is the model behind the dog app application. It uses several annotations from this system.componentModel.dataAnnotations namespace. So the first one is that you can see that the ID is required. You always have to provide an ID. If it's not provided, the view is able to use the error message that ID is required, and you can provide whatever string you want there. Then you have the name of the dog. This is also required, and so there's an error message saying that the name is required. But the length of the name is also limited to 15 characters. If the user enters more characters, the view can display an error message saying that the name cannot be more than 15 characters. The age is also required, and it has a range of 0 to 20. Okay, this may or may not be realistic. Relatively few dogs live beyond 20. But generally sled dogs don't, and that's my perspective. So we'll leave it at 0 to 20. And in this case, you can have an error message of must be between 0 and 20. So again, the nice thing about this is that because you're using these data annotations within the model, no matter where this model is used, MVC is going to enforce those validation attributes. And as you can see, you can add as many validation attributes to a particular property as is appropriate. All right, so how does the rest of the application put these to use? Well, both the view and the controller have a role in the validation. The way that the view uses validation is strikingly similar to the use of validation server controls in an ASP.NET Web Forms application. There's a validation message for helper method and a couple variations of that you can use in a view that look inside the model and displays an error message for any properties with invalid data. You can also use a validation summary helper method to display a summary of all problems in one place. And all of this is based on the state of the model when the view displays its data. So let's take a look at the create view. So first what we have is the validation summary. It has a specific error message, cannot create the dog, please correct errors and try again. So that's going to be essentially the introductory text to the validation summary. And then there's going to be bullet points with all of the problems that appear on the form. And then there's also this validation message for each of the fields that then displays the validation message if there is a problem with any of that data. All right, then the last piece of the validation puzzle is the controller action method that handles the posted form data. So let's go into dog controller here and down to the create method. So here is where the controller is taking an active hand in making sure that the user has entered valid data. So this is a familiar pattern. We're just checking to see if the model state is valid, and if it's not, we return back to that page and the user can make corrections. And it's at this point that the validation summary kicks in because the model state is not valid. And MVC keeps track of what's not valid, and then each of the individual items is able to display the error message. And you'll find a similar chunk of code that checks the isValid method within the edit method as well. So let's go ahead and run the application. Go to the dog list, create the new, and now what I'm going to do is not enter any data whatsoever and click on the Create button. So here's the validation summary, as well as a list of all the problems. And then you also have next to each field a list of each of the problems. And as a nice touch, the style sheet for the standard MVC ASP.NET web application will change the appropriate text box to a kind of a pinkish color. So the user has no opportunity whatsoever to miss that there are problems on this page. Now, displaying each of these messages twice is probably a little bit of overkill. If you're going to use a validation summary, maybe what you're going to do instead is just display an asterisk here. So you have a lot of options in how you display this information to the user. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and enter some data. So I'll enter a 1 there. I'll enter Izzy this time. And we'll make Izzy 120 years old. So now we're providing all the information, but the other data validation is kicked in. And it has to be between 0 and 20. So I'll change that to 12, click on the Create button, and finally we've met all of the data validation requirements and the information is added to the list of dogs. All of the validation that I've shown you so far has been server-side validation. That means that the data is posted back to the server. The create method of the product controller checks it, and then it generates some response that's returned to the user. That's probably a reasonably acceptable user interface, but it can be much better. If validation also occurs on the client, the user interface is even more responsive to the user. As the user fixes problems with the data and leaves an input element, the error messages disappear. So that's a much richer user interface. Now, to enable client-side validation, you need to add a call to the Enable Client Validation Helper method to the view. For all of the built-in validation helper methods and data annotations, simply calling this method at the top of a view is going to cause the application to generate client-side JavaScript code to provide this rich validation client-side user experience. So let's see how this works. Here's the create view of the dog controller. Notice that the enable client validation method call is there, but it's commented out. It's commented out using the special ASP.NET comment delimiter. Unlike the HTML comment delimiter, which is an angle bracket, bang, or exclamation mark, followed by 2 dashes, this version of the comment will not send the comment contents down to the browser. So you can include comments in the page and not have them visible within the page source from the browser. All right, so I need to uncomment this. And that's all we need to do in order to enable client-side validation. So I'll go ahead and run the application again. Okay, what happened there is that because I had the Create view selected, Visual Studio got confused. So all I need to do is come over here, select the project name, and then run the application. All right, now we can go into the dog list and create a new dog. So I'll select the first field and I'll tab through them. Notice that I don't get any error messages. That's because validation only kicks in when you provide data. So now what I'll do is I'll go in and enter a name for a dog. And I'll do some really long, way too long dog name that I would never use. Okay, obviously not a dog name that I would ever name a dog. And I'll hit the Tab button, and notice that without a postback, the validation error message immediately pops up. That's client-side validation. All right, I'll do Shift-Tab and go back there, and I'll delete that. And notice that the previous error message disappears, but now the name is required. So this time I'll use Raja. And as you can see, the error message disappears as soon as I type even a single character. So that's all you need to do to add client-side validation. It kind of seems like magic, but if you look at the view source, you can see that MVC has added a Microsoft Ajax.js JavaScript file and a Microsoft MVC validation JavaScript file. So it uses the code in those two files in order to implement these client-side features. And then if you scroll down in the page, you'll see that it also includes some JSON data that has all of the information that it needs in order to provide the validation. And so, for example, here we have the name field, and it has the maximum length property set to 15. And so you can look through and see that this has all of the information that the client-side JavaScript code needs in order to implement validation. Client-side validation in an MVC application isn't magic, but it's really well implemented so that it almost seems like magic.